Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In the spring of 1940, Hitler's armies smashed across the borders of the Netherlands and Belgium and streamed into the northern regions of France. The German blitzkrieg moved swiftly to the west and to the south, splitting the British and French defenders, trapping the British army at Dunkirk and forcing its evacuation from continental Europe. The Germans entered Paris on June 14th and forced France's surrender on June 22nd. The British now stood alone, awaiting Hitler's inevitable attempt to invade and conquer their island, or so they thought. Well, Great Britain was in trouble. The soldiers rescued from Dunkirk were exhausted by their ordeal. Worse, most of their heavy armaments lay abandoned and rusting on the French beaches. After a short rest, the Germans began air raids in early summer designed to seize mastery of the skies over England in preparation for invasion. They needed air supremacy over the English Channel. All that stood between the British and defeat was a small force of RAF pilots outnumbered in the air by 4-1. Day after day, the Germans sent armadas of bombers and fighters over England, hoping to lure the RAF into battle and annihilate the defenders. Day after day, the RAF scrambled their pilots into the sky to do battle, often 3, 4, or 5 times a day. Britain's air defenses bent, but didn't break. By September, the Germans lost enthusiasm for the assault. Hitler postponed and then canceled invasion plans, turning his attention to the defeat of Russia. In appreciation of the RAF pilots' heroic effort, Winston Churchill declared, "Never before in human history was so much owed by so many to so few." Okay, that is a very brief overview of the bombing of England and the Battle of Britain. In this episode, I'm going to be focusing on this early part of World War II and what happened, but specifically I'm going to look at RAF tactics used against German bombers, and also individual accounts of RAF pilots and civilians and other people. The inspiration for this episode comes from a specific listener question, Vic Austin, and he asks, "What I'd like to hear is a show covering RAF Fighter Command's role in the Battle of Britain and the key decisions or influence that Churchill had in daily operations." That's what I'm going to do in this episode, and I'm gladly answering Vic's question, as I love to answer audience questions, and Vic is a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, so I am obligated to answer his question, but I do so with great enthusiasm because this is an interesting slice of history. The Battle of Britain is famous in early World War II, but it's not just about the heroics of fighting German bombers. What we see is a rapid evolution in military avionics and military aerial tactics. Remember, this is the 1940s. This is only a few decades into human flight, and World War II is a watershed period in the use of air forces in warfare. And this is where you see the doctrines of air superiority and air supremacy being hammered out. You have to control the skies before you can do anything else. This wasn't a doctrine universally believed in the first few decades of aircraft. And some thought that if bombers could get through, then you had absolutely no defense whatsoever. That if a nation wanted to keep sending bombers, even if some bombers were shot out of the sky, eventually a few would get through and be able to bomb a city. So if one nation had enough bombers, there was effectively nothing you could do to counter them. And this is what some English people thought, who feared that the German aerial assault on Britain would ultimately succeed no matter what. So there's a lot to tackle in this episode. So what I'm going to do is first paint an overview from the perspective of Churchill and how he sees the Battle of Britain. Then I'm going to go into the specific RAF tactics in the Battle of Britain, and also the German Luftwaffe tactics as well, to see what they're thinking in the skies. And then we're going to look at personal accounts. So let's jump right into it. First, looking at things from the perspective of Churchill. With Great Britain led by a man known for refusal to negotiate with Nazi Germany, the nation fell into one of its worst crises of the 20th century. Britain had a massive expeditionary force on the European continent, and this is in 1940. In about 6 weeks, Germany defeated the Western Allies. In May 1940, German soldiers trapped 400,000 British and French troops between the cliffs and the sea at Dunkirk, located on France's northern coast. British troops were evacuated across the English Channel by means of ship, yacht, and even rowboat. Had those soldiers been killed or captured, the Allied forces would have been critically short of manpower and likely been forced to surrender to Axis powers. Without any hope left from across the Channel, France surrendered to Hitler within 3 weeks. Churchill referred to this period as the darkest hour, and this is when the Battle of Britain takes place. The period between the fall of France in 1940 and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 saw Germany focus much of its military might on Britain when it alone stood against Nazi Germany and the Axis powers in Europe. During those 363 days, the British couldn't decide if it was worse to be invaded or see its nation be completely destroyed by bombing raids. Much of Europe was under Axis control. America had not yet entered the war, and many doubted it ever would, while the Soviet Union held a fragile alliance with Hitler. Observers thought the effort to be hopeless. U.S. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy sent reports to Washington of the increasingly dire nature of the war effort. His views were shared by military experts in Europe, America, and even Britain. One element of British public and political sentiment favored a negotiated peace with Germany, and among them was the British Foreign Secretary. But Churchill refused to consider an armistice. Although at times personally pessimistic about British chances for victory, Churchill told Hastings Ismay on June 12, 1940, that "you and I will be dead in 3 months' time," his use of rhetoric hardened public opinion against a peaceful resolution and prepared the British for a long war. And for Churchill to maintain optimism of British victory in the darkest days of World War II required a sense of hope that appeared to some civilians and advisors to border on lunacy. In September 1940, German bombers began to appear over London. Hitler changed tactics in his attempts to subdue Great Britain. In the previous 2 months, the Luftwaffe targeted RAF airfields and radar stations in order to weaken the nation to the point that he could launch a German invasion. When he realized such an offensive launch was impossible, just because of the difficulty of amphibious assaults, and because it would deplete too much manpower from the Eastern Front, he switched to a campaign of fear and intimidation. Bombing London to ruin would demoralize the population to the point of hopelessness and surrender, so he thought. At 4 o'clock on September 7th, 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, bombed London for 2 hours. A second group arrived at 8 p.m., continuing attacks throughout the night. Bombing runs continued until May in a series of attacks known as the Blitz, reducing London and other cities to smoldering ruins. The early stages in particular, the first 57 days, saw German bombing raids day and night. The lowest moment is considered by historians to be May 10th, 1941, when 1,500 civilians were killed by bombings on London alone. Much of the city was on fire. Residents walking to work quickly ran to underground stations when the warning sirens wailed. As they waited at air raid shelters, they knew that a well-targeted bomb could level the building and kill them all. In the worst incident, 450 were killed when a bomb destroyed a school building used as a shelter. Ernie Pyle, a war correspondent, described a night raid on London in 1940 as such. It was a night when London was ringed and stabbed with fire. They came just after dark, and somehow you could sense from the quick, bitter firing of the guns that there was to be no monkey business this night. Shortly after the sirens wailed, you could hear the Germans grinding overhead. In my room, with its black curtains drawn across the windows, you could feel the shake from the guns. You could hear the boom, crump, crump, crump of heavy bombs at their work of tearing buildings apart. Into the dark, shadowed spaces below us, while we watched, whole batches of incendiary bombs fell. We saw 24 go off in 2 seconds. They flashed terrifically, then quickly simmered down to pinpoints of dazzling white, burning ferociously. These white pinpoints would go out one by one as the unseen heroes of the moment smothered them with sand. But also, while we watched, other pinpoints would burn on, and soon a yellow flame would leap up from the white center. They had done their work. Another building was on fire. This is what Churchill sees from his perch. And as the nation stared at likely extinction, he made the case for British victory in his May 13, 1940 speech to the House of Commons. He shrugged off calls by some politicians, and allegedly a few members of the royal family, to seek accommodation with Hitler. Entitled Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat, It's one of his most well-known samples of his oratory and considered to be a masterclass of rhetoric. One historian called its effect on Parliament electrifying. The House of Commons, that had ignored him during the 1930s during Churchill's wilderness years from British politics, was now listening and cheering him on. Churchill spoke as such. "You ask what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." The speech was not only rhetoric, but a call to action. This was his first speech as Prime Minister. He informed Parliament he would put national differences aside and form a national government that included all parties in order to wage a united war against Germany. He said he would tell them what he told his new minister. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." So for the next year, Britain held its resolve. It was battered but didn't crumble. In fact, the war energized Churchill, who was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister. On June 18, 1940, Churchill attempted to lift up England following the fall of France and the successful evacuation of most of England's supporting forces from the continent. At the moment of great apparent danger to British national survival, he spoke not only of endurance, but of noble causes of which Britain was fighting, specifically freedom, Christian civilization, the rights of small nations. He said, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour." His lofty rhetoric largely matched his governing strategy. On July 3, 1940, Churchill told Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky, "My general strategy at present is to last out the next 3 months." His mind was fixed on holding a feeble defense of Britain against German attacks until the Luftwaffe could focus its efforts elsewhere and they could regather their resources. Publicly, Churchill continued to uplift the nation with powerful rhetoric. He never considered the cause to be lost or allow the British public to think that its leaders would abandon them. In Churchill's hundreds of speeches, memoranda, and even privately recorded remarks, he never appeared to doubt the ultimate outcome of British victory and German defeat. Before the Nazis turned their military machine away from Britain and toward the Soviet Union, giving Britain much-needed relief from endless waves of assault, Churchill confided to an aide that the British policy would be to continue to fight on. An American journalist wrote in 1941, "The responsibilities which are his now must be greater than those carried by any other human being on earth." One would think such a weight would have had a crushing effect on him. Not at all. The last time I saw him, while the Battle of Britain was still raging, he looked 20 years younger than before the war began. His uplifted spirit is transmitted to the people. Other military leaders notice his upbeat style and natural political instinct. American General Officer Hap Arnold met him on April 19, 1941, describing Churchill as a huge personality who possessed the most wonderful mind. At dinner that night, Arnold observed that he found that Churchill had a wonderfully detailed knowledge of all phases of military operations, past and present. He said, "A tour of a military post with Churchill reminded me of one of Roosevelt's, in that everywhere he was received with great enthusiasm and spontaneous ovations. I noticed Churchill was able to change his manner, his approach, depending entirely upon the particular situation confronting him, or the plight or circumstances of the people with whom he was talking. He could register pathos, he could be gracious and winning in his ways, he could register sorrow or great joy, or be enthusiastic or sympathetic." So as the months rolled on, Germany appeared on the march to victory, but privately it waned under Britain's resolve. On May 1st, 1941, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's top Nazi officer fluent in English, flew to a meeting with British aristocrats to make an incredible offer. Britain, which at the time was losing the war with the Hitler-Stalin alliance, could have peace with Germany if it stayed neutral in the coming battle between Germany and Russia. Hitler even offered to evacuate France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. The only conditions were that Germany keep parts of Luxembourg and Alsace-Lorraine. Also, that Churchill step down as Prime Minister and Britain give Germany a free hand in Eastern Europe. Hitler obsessed over controlling Russian farmland and resources, but Churchill refused to step down and the offer was rejected. Churchill's resolve was rewarded 7 months later when the United States announced its entry into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941.